Russia has taken total control of the front lines, and the question is, how did we get here? Even the mainstream media confirms that the Russians has taken total control of the front lines, and this reminds me of, I think, CNN survey they did recently. According to the CNN survey, over 69% of Ukrainians don't believe in Ukraine victory again. So even the Ukrainians themselves don't believe in Ukraine victory again. Today, even Ukrainian commanders are confirming that they have lost this battle and the Russians has taken total control of the front lines. Let us analyze what exactly went wrong, the mistakes that the Ukrainians did, and how these mistakes is going to cause them in future. Well, let's get started. So what I'm going to do is I am going to compare these mistakes that the Ukrainians did to previous wars. So we'll be talking a lot about history today. Number one is standstill fight. Germany used this strategy in the Second World War against the Russians, and the Ukrainians repeated the same mistake. I remember back in 2022, I said Ukraine was doing a big mistake. The standstill fight strategy is pure disaster, and when you try using the standstill fight strategy against Russia, obviously the Russians are going to finish you. They are going to win against you. Now, what is standstill fight? Standstill fight is the style of warfare whereby you protect a piece of land or a piece of territory at all costs, regardless the odds, whether the odds are favoring you or not. You hold on to that territory, even if your opponent is unaliving your soldiers. You prefer to hold that piece of territory at all costs. That is what standstill fight is. Now, the Russians do not engage in standstill fight. Let's take Second World War for example. Now, when the Germans or when the Nazis invaded the Russians, they invaded the Russians through Crimea. Remember, back then, Crimea was part of the Russian Empire. So when they invaded Crimea, the Russians decided to withdraw their troops from Crimea, whilst the Germans decided to hold on to Crimea. The Russians do not engage in standstill fight. They don't fight for territories, whilst the Ukrainians were fighting for territories. The Russians do not hold on to a piece of land. Their military doctrine, they believe that they are fighting against an army. So their doctrine is to defeat that army. Once they defeat the army, everywhere belongs to them. Now, I use Crimea as an example. When the Nazis invaded Crimea, the Russians decided to retreat. Now, the Russians could have fought in Crimea, but they decided not to fight. They decided to retreat. Now, typical example again is in Stalingrad. The odds were against the Nazis, but instead of Hitler to withdraw German forces from Stalingrad, he refused. And that is how the Russians were able to defeat the Germans in Stalingrad. So Stalingrad was pure disaster for the Germans. Germany was supposed to withdraw their troops completely from Stalingrad, but they decided to engage in standstill fight. And that is exactly what the Ukrainians also did in the beginning of this war. For example, Kherson. The Russians decided to withdraw some of their forces from Kherson, Liman, and other territories. Boom. The Ukrainians went in and claimed that they have won. They took that as victory. But the withdrawal was for strategic reasons. The Russians withdraw their forces to a better position where they can fire artillery into Kherson mainland. And I don't know, there are some words I don't want to use because YouTube will obviously block the video. But the Ukrainians decided to come in, then the media went in and the media started broadcasting that Ukraine has defeated Russian troops. Then the Ukrainians took over. When they came in fact, the casualties the Ukrainians suffered was catastrophic. But because the media already covered Kherson as Ukrainian victory, so they held on to that piece of land at all cost, despite all the casualties that the Russians were inflicting on them. They refused to withdraw, and that cost the Ukrainian army a lot. Now, another disadvantage for the Ukrainians was country size. Obviously, Russia is bigger than Ukraine. And economy, the Russians have bigger economy more than Ukraine. So in war of attrition, what you need most is better economy. If you don't have good economy, you can't fight war of attrition. And obviously, the Ukrainian economy was in bad shape whilst the Russians' economy was in good shape. And to make matters worse for the Ukrainians had no weapons. They had to rely on Western and American weapons. Now, another disadvantage for the Ukrainians was experience. Ukraine don't have experience in war, unlike the Russians. The Russians have more experience in war more than the Ukrainians. I know some people will say that, oh, they were all part of the USSR, blah, blah, blah. Note, the Russian state existed for thousands of years before the formation of the USSR. And Russia as a state has always been at war. So they have more experience in war. And that is why they never bow to Western pressure. They never bow to whatever the media was saying about them. They knew very well that it was just a matter of time. And that is the results that we are now seeing, right? So once they have experience in war, they decided to choose war of attrition instead of going in for maneuver warfare for short victory. They didn't go in for short victory. They aimed for a long victory. And that is why this war has lasted for the past 3.5 years. And they are still fighting. Another disadvantage for the Ukrainians was weapons disadvantage. The Russians produce their own weapons, while the Ukrainians have to rely on somebody giving them these weapons. Now, when you look at Russia production, Russia produced more weapons more than the West and America combined. So even at the full-scale production of the West and America combined, the Russians will still outproduce them. It is a fact. The West and America combined, they produce less than 30,000 shells in a month. I hope I am right, according to Conor McGregor and according to most experts in the West. America cannot produce more than 30,000 shells a month. No. And the reason is simple. You see, the Western America, their military-industrial complex is owned by private entities. Unlike the Russians, the military-industrial complex is owned by the state. So, after Second World War, the Russians promised never to allow what the Nazis did to them to ever happen again. One of the main reasons why Russia suffered this huge amount of casualties in Second World War, because Russia as a state was not prepared when the Nazis invaded them. So the Russians decided never to allow that happen to them again. So most of their weapons, they produce the parts. For example, if the Russians want to assemble T-72 tank, they can assemble more than 100 in a month, or more than even 500 in a month, because they are not producing the spare parts from scratch. Most of the spare parts are already there. What they do is they assemble in terms of war. But on the Ukrainian side, it is completely different. Now, let's put Ukraine aside. Now, Ukraine rely on America and the West. Because these companies, because of this Western and American company belongs to private entities, so they only operate when they are given contract. Without contract, they don't operate. Now, according to experts, the Russians can launch more than 1,000 drones in every 3 to 4 days. Yes. So in a week, the Russians can launch more than 1,000 drones, or 1,500 or 2,000 drones just in 1 month. So yesterday, according to the Ukrainian side and the Russian side on Telegram, they said the Russians launched more than 1,000 drones. But some of these drones were decoy to deceive the air defense systems. Now, one weapon disadvantage currently, when you look at the Ukrainians, they don't have enough air defense systems to counter these Russian drones. The Russians can launch these drones. Now, according to experts, the Russians have produced a lot of these Gerard 2 drones. The Russians can launch more than 2,000 of these in a month. So expect to see Ukraine, getting destroyed in the coming days, because the Russians have been able to stockpile these Gerard 2 drones. Now, let's go back to history. When we take the Battle of Kursk, for example, or the Battle of Tanks, is popularly known as the Battle of Tanks. The Russians were clearly winning against the Germans. So Hitler was supposed to withdraw his forces from Kursk, but he refused and decided to push the German soldiers and German tank commanders to Kursk, and the Russians annihilated them completely. Another clear example is Napoleon's invasion of Russia. The Russians decided to withdraw from Moscow completely. Moscow has been a big city from day one. Moscow and St. Petersburg has always been a big city in Russia. But the Russians decided to withdraw completely from Moscow. And Napoleon took over Moscow. By the time Napoleon arrived in Moscow, the Russians decided to open prisoners for Napoleon. Now, they were retreating deep. They burned down their own cities. Napoleon was following them. Napoleon, it's a history for another day. But the main point is, the Russians are not afraid to withdraw their soldiers and allow you to occupy a piece of territory. And this was what the Ukrainians thought. They thought they were winning because of the Russians' withdrawal from some territories. They came in and occupied, thinking that they have won the battle. Go and ask Napoleon. When the Russians were going deeper, Napoleon was following them. It got to a point Napoleon couldn't find his way out of Russia. In fact, the Russians defeated him completely. He went with over 400,000 men and came back with less than 40,000 men. So this is the same thing or the same mistake I see the Ukrainians doing. For example, in Liman, in Kherson, in Zaporozhye, there were some territories that the Russians withdrew their forces. But it was strategic withdrawal. They moved their soldiers to a better position, to a better artillery position, whereby they can fire their artillery at the Ukrainian forces. Between this month to next month, my prediction is Ukraine will surrender if the West don't step in. The West must send soldiers and money urgently to Ukraine because Ukraine is currently in a desperate mood. If the West refuses to do so, Ukraine will surrender. The Russians are going to defeat the Ukrainians completely and force the Ukrainians to negotiation table. That is my prediction. Put down today's date. By the way, thank you very much for watching this video. The name still remains Timo Media, and I really appreciate you guys, your love and support for this channel. Where are you watching this video from? Let me know down in the comment section. This will help me know those of you who watch the video till the very end. Shalom. See you guys in the next episode.